Next presenter is Harald Wolf. He comes from Sociological Research Institute at University of Göttingen in Germany. So the title of his presentation is "The Capital as an Imaginary Institution of Power."
Thank you very much. So the title changed a bit, and therefore I made one slide only for overview. Title is "Capital as Imaginary Institution of Power and its Alternative." And well, first of all, thanks a lot for inviting me to Toronto, and I'm very glad to be able to discuss all this very interesting stuff together with you. Yes, in their brilliant book, Capital as Power, Jonathan Nitzan and Bichler open new research perspectives with implications and consequences to social theory. I want to explore some of them. The trail to be followed here was laid by Nitzan and Bichler themselves. In several parts of their work, they allude to eminent French social theorist Cornelius Castoriadis and his opus magnum, The Imaginary Institution of Society. Although these references don't connect the two theoretical outlooks in a systematic way, based on Castoriadis and on the social theoretical figures of thinking introduced by him, I will attempt to compare some main topics of capital as power and social and society as imaginary institution, hoping to achieve a more systematic connection or reciprocal elucidation of the two theoretical frameworks. As can be seen from my abstract for the paper, I originally choose capitalism as rationalization and control project, capital and labor, capital and market, and imaginary of capital and imaginary of power as comparative topics. However, this proved to be much too ambitious as a starting point. Indeed, these comprehensive topics may be signposts for studies of years to come. Instead, I would like to start today with the obvious, that is, with the concept of power, a concept essential to Nitzan and Bichler, as well as to Castoriadis. It seems to me that power is an excellent starting point to approach the other topics as well. Therefore, I will portray and explain Castoriadis' concept of power and his thinking figure of the power of the imaginary. That's my second point. Then I will confront this figure with the notion of power, very sketchily, of course, of Nitzan and Bichler. Doing this, some of the topics mentioned above will come to the fore. It's my third point. Summing up, I will try to draw first conclusions from this confrontation. But as a first step, and to achieve a better understanding, I will introduce a distinction, the distinction between power over and power to, or in a different version, between transitive and intransitive power. It's my first point now, ambiguities of power from the transitive to the intransitive. As you well know, concerning the concept of power, complete ambiguity and considerable confusion prevail. Despite this ambiguity, however, a lot of what is commonly said about power can be better understood and discussed if a difference is made between power as transitive, relational, as power over, or as intransitive, power to. Power over, the predominant concept, refers to a social relationship between those who execute power and those who are subjected to power. The prototype goes back to Weber. As you know, he defines power as, I cite, each chance or ability within a social relationship to enforce one's own will even on the face of conflict or resistance, no matter on what this chance is based. Power over is seen, even if you look at it from a negative point of view and criticize it from the perspective of those who execute power. From there, it refers to something outside, respectively downwards, to others, and thus can be regarded as transitive power. In final analysis, this can be reduced to a simple formula which designates a causal relationship between ego and alter. The power of ego is the cause, which causes a certain behavior of alter against his or her will. The concept of power over implies that power is already available, so to speak, and can be used and invested by likewise available actors. The concept of action is teleological, and one of instrumental rationality. Power is applied as a means to achieve certain fixed aims. Questions of its distribution, its relations, and its effects on others prevail. The concept of power too is different. Here, power appears as an ability, an attribute, as productive and intransitive. For it is power that establishes the abilities to act and to act together, and thus becomes a condition of sociability through which the respective social actors constitute themselves as actors in the first place. It is this intransitive, self-referential power that actually creates a common space for action, produces and structures social mutuality, and points of reference, constitutes and institutes valid aims and possible means, values and norms. If Weber's definition of power can be seen as the prototype of the transitive concept of power, then the definition by Hannah Arendt is an extreme example for this antipole of power as power too. I call it extreme because she reserves the term of power only to these constitutive, self-referential, intransitive aspects. All other aspects are subsumed under the concept of violence, we had it, Gewalt in German, respectively of coercion, Zwang, and political rule, politische Herrschaft. Instead of discussing Hannah Arendt here, I will rather turn to Castoriadis' figure of the power of the imaginary. It is a concept that, as will be shown, stresses the constitutive and self-referential aspects of social power as well. So I come to my second point, Castoriadis, the power of the imaginary. The imaginary, as radical imagination of the psyche and as radical imaginary of society, is the core of Castoriadis' thinking. At first, radical imagination means the fundamental creative element in the domain of the psychical. And like the psychical, to Castoriadis, also the domain of the social historical is a mode of being that, in this respect, is mostly misconceived. It is neither appropriately conceivable with the common terminology of the traditional discourse as a subject, nor as a thing or a concept. The self-creating, self-instituting society, in every individual case emerging in specific institutions, is, as he calls it, the radical imaginary, the basic capacity by and in the anonymous collective to implement imaginary significations. And institutions that carry these significations and keep them alive are constitutive of the identity of a certain society and a certain type of individuals who reproduce this society. Now, remember Weber's definition of power. There, power appears as the superior power of disposal by one part of society which exerts inevitable influence over another, inferior part of society. Here, a specific society is always already presupposed, a society whose parts exercise power one upon the other or use power as varying stakes in a game, no matter what the chances in this game are based on or wherein its rules consist. But of course, the specific character of the game, its fundamental rules that define and distribute its options and restrictions also exercise power over the players. Only the fundamental rule-creating and rule-setting power determines those relevant parts of society which are able to appear as superior and inferior, and they do so only in its given framework. It is firstly this power which Castoriadis wants to elucidate. Castoriadis is concerned with the fundamental power of society to make the asocial social, as far as possible, particularly regarding the psyche. Here, the imaginary acts as a framing and formative power and force which frames and forms the subjects. Castoriadis describes this procedure of socialization, which is an ongoing, lifelong process, as a process of power execution and coercion. At the same time, this process concerns the most difficult and most powerful form of intermediation, the intermediation between psychic imaginations and social imaginary. Before any open exercise of power, any institution of society thereby exerts on all individuals a radical infra-power or ground power, as Castoriadis calls it. This infra-power, an expression of the instituting and instituted power of the radical imaginary, cannot be localized anywhere. It is never the power of a certain individual or of any identifiable instance. It quasi-combines the forces of the instituting imaginary, the instituted society, and its entire past history. I cite ultimately, therefore, Castoriadis says, we are dealing with the power of the social historical field itself, the power of outis, of nobody. If that were everything, then this infra-power or ground power would have to be absolute, and the system would eternally be reproduced. But historicity is always at work, be it that external nature causes change, or that the internal nature, the psyche, transcends limits in unpredictable ways, or be it that the interaction with other societies thus enforce change. To Castoriadis, after all, the most important cause of change is the radical imaginary itself, covered under the established order of things, beneath a side which is insurmountable historicity continues to work imperceptibly and over very long periods. At this point, where the instituted society is most vulnerable, the strongest mechanism of defense against change, the denial and the covering up of the instituting dimension of society is being established by the fact that the origins and the basis of the institution are attributed to an extra social source. For Castoriadis, this is the main characteristic of social heteronomy. Imaginary significations are taking a life of their own and dominate society as pseudo-nature. But this order can and will always result from the indicated factors. Therefore, there will always be a dimension of the social institution that deals with the re-establishment of the given order, the protection of society, of its mere existence, and more or less regulated functioning. This is one of the reasons for explicit power, as Castoriadis calls it. Above all, however, the following has to be added. Unawareness and uncertainty concerning the future do not permit a comprehensive determination of decisions in advance, even in the most stable traditional society. Thus, explicit power derives from the necessity to make decisions about what to do and what to let be. A judging and or governing power must always be explicitly present as soon as there is a society. I cite, the question of nomos may be covered up by a society, but this cannot be done as regards dike, the judiciary, and telos, the governmental. Castoriadis calls the dimension of explicit power of society the dimension of the political, for which it is insignificant whether the corresponding instances are embodied in a whole tribe, the elder, the warriors, a king, the demos, a bureaucratic apparatus, or capital. To him, this dimension of explicit power is the second derivative, the dimension of social power, derivative and dependent of its primary imaginary and its ground power. The political of a society means all forms of power distribution between its members, its actors, and its respective institutions of exertion of power and control, and thus the dimension of power over. To Castoriadis, capitalist institutions are mainly characterized by their exertion of power over humans and objects in the imaginary perspective of an unlimited dimension of pseudo-rational, pseudo-control by means of diverse mechanisms of governing and ruling of objects and humans, or humans as objects. One central mechanism for this is formal, bureaucratic, hierarchic organization. This capitalist organization has become the dominant form of regulation and utilization of collective ventures and activities. However, this form of utilization is inherently contradictory, as it is based at the same time on the drive to exclude people from necessary discretion and the necessity to include them. In capitalist organizations, labor can never be reduced to a completely adapted, heteronomous and externally controlled behavior, and thus can never be really subsumed under capital, as a Marxist would say. To the contrary, inclusion and self-activity of the workers remain indispensable to the functioning of capitalist organization as well as for its evolution. To put it bluntly, the capitalist control project does not work if people only function in it. They have to be resistant. At least they have to act differently from the way it was envisaged. After all, on one hand, this is the only source of productivity and innovation. On the other hand, it is also a source of an alternative project of social cooperation. Thank you. And social order. In Castoriadis' words, the project of autonomy. Consequently, Castoriadis develops a multi-dimensional notion of power. To him, there is the basic dimension of infra-power, connected to the central concept of the imaginary institution. The imaginary creates power too. As a second dimension of power, he suggests the political of a society dealing with distribution of power between its members, the actors, and their specific institutions of power exertion and control, and thus with power over. The capitalist institutions of power exertion and control are characterized by inner contradictions and by vulnerability to crisis. I will come back to this later and now come to my third point, the power of capital. Only explicit capitalization, question mark. The first point that I want to make is that the approach of capital as power takes power primarily in its transitive, explicit dimension. Capital as power is firstly power over, and secondly is mainly concerned with the political in the sense of Castoriadis, albeit without considering the aspects of contradiction of the capitalist political that Castoriadis brings to the fore. My second point is that Nitzan and Bichler already introduced some of the approaches to a wider understanding. Let me explain. Concerning my first point, to Nitzan and Bichler, capitalist power is the means of business and also its most fundamental aim. And at the same time, all capital is finance and only finance. Capitalism is a specific power pre-order, mainly through its through its dynamics in the process of the permanent revolution of the scientific ideological mindset, and because of the process of permanent capitalization. To the capitalists, the convergence of these processes, which are transmitted through the market, allows a government over society that is historically unique. Technology and technical change can be used as power tools, and prices, inflation, can be used to reconstruct power. In addition, perhaps most important, property titles can be bought and sold in order to reorganize power directly. To Nitzan and Bichler, power is no absolute but a relative entity. It is a differential nature. It has a differential nature and acquires, I cite, its meaning only when gauged against other powers. That is, when it is seen as distribution of power. I cite, it is only in capitalism where power is translated into the universal units of capitalization that the differential nature of power really takes center stage. End of citation. In capitalism, these units are the symbolic representation of power, of their owners, the ruling class. Their power units are measured and compared in prices. They are being used by their owners to control social activities, last not least, but not only the production, and thereby generate earnings and minimize risks to future earnings. In this way, power is being used, increased, and accumulated as capital. This power of the capitalist ego of the ruling class and the capitalist nomos expressed by it is being imposed or subjected to a potentially resistant anti-capitalist altar. Everything that Nitzan and Bichler say about the capitalist mode and logic of power seems to me insightful and of high consequence for the analysis of society. I refer, thank you, to the groundbreaking analysis of the capitalization algorithm and models of finance as a collective ethos of the capitalists and as medium of the permanent restructuring and reshaping of the capitalist order. So I skip a bit. However, as the indicated formulations and further formulations will show, its explicit theorizations are largely limited to capital as explicit power, as I see it, to mechanisms of governing society by means of capitalization, and as power over, mechanisms of ruling society through ego over alter. In this way, two aspects are not taken into consideration in a satisfactory way. First, the intransitive social dimension of the basic power too, and second, the contradictory character of the capitalist order, and consequently the question of a social alternative. Let me begin with the second aspect. Is capital really solely and only finance? Do we not have to take into consideration systematically that capital is basically also a phenomenon of organization? Everything that has to be capitalized also has to be organized, and vice versa. Nitzan and Bichler's recourse on Lewis Mumford and the characterization of capital as a modern mega machine tries to accommodate this already. By doing this, they also define capitalism as a project of domination and control in the form of organization. This concept touches in many ways on Castoriadis' concept, who, by the way, also refers to Mumford. Admittedly, it depends on analyzing the concrete functioning of the bureaucratic, hierarchical mega-machines of capital, if not only to make fractures, disorders, and sand visible in the gear mechanism of this machine. According to the analysis of Castoriadis, these fractures and disorders are ubiquitous and lead to a dependency of resources that cannot be produced and also not be controlled by the machine. So I have to hurry up. So I think if we look at the internal contradictions of the organization of capital, there are already signs of practical criticism of self-activity and resistance, which already evolve in everyday conflicts with these contradictions and problems. They do not have to, but they may lead to the demand for autonomy and thus to the demand for an alternative principle of social order. And in regard to the first aspect I mentioned, the neglect of power too, there are also approaches in Nitzan and Bichler that could be specified with a little help of motives of Castoriadis. The concept of society as order, it's a very good neologism of to create order, creation and order, could be such an approach. It more or less corresponds to the terms instituting the creation moment and instituted the moment of order in Castoriadis. A order can be, so Nitzan and Bichler, hierarchical or horizontal. In the first case, Nitzan and Bichler call it power order. In the latter case, democratic order. But the latter terms are misleading because all orders are power orders. In a comprehensive sense, they are power to and power over at the same time. The decisive difference lies elsewhere. It is the difference between heteronomous and autonomous order or institution. In the first case, the imaginary sources of the self-creation of society remain hidden, and its products are converted into entities that seem pre-social or non-social: God, king, capital, reason. Everything is subjected to these entities and everything essential comes from them. Corresponding to this are explicit power arrangements that safeguard the reproduction of this heteronomy, hierarchical structures of social inequality and government with the ultimate objective, the actual result, of exclusion of most people from the judging and governing power, let alone the reflection and decision about the question of nomos. The autonomous institution, however, consciously sets the inclusion of all into processes of norm setting and decision as its target, and this target implies the greatest equality of distribution of social power possible, as well as the greatest freedom of its exercise and utilization. That is real democracy. So, do I have 2 minutes or? Okay. Then I must skip my conclusion. Thank you very much.
Any questions?
Well, would you like to give your conclusion? Yes. The main points, perhaps. So I said a lot of things before, but to stress my last point about that, I think real difference is not, as Jonathan and Shimshon write in their book, between power orders and democratic orders, but between heteronomous and autonomous orders. I think that capital is as much an imaginary institution of power as its alternative. The alternative to capitalist heteronomy is autonomy, and autonomy also has to be conceived as power in all mentioned dimensions. Castoriadis refers to the pursuit of collective autonomy as politics, and as difference to the political, calls it politics, which is defined by him apart from the always existing dimension of the political as, last citation, the explicit collective activity which aims at being lucid, reflective, and deliberate, and whose object is the institution of society as such. It is, therefore, a coming into light, though certainly partial, of the instituting in person. A dramatic, though by no means exclusive, illustration of this is presented by the moments of revolution. The creation of politics takes place when the established institution of society is put into question as such, and in its various aspects and dimensions. That is to say, when another relation is created between the instituting and the instituted. And in my words, and there's just one other sentence of Castoriadis, but in my words, politics would be the attempt of a conscious appropriation of the social infra-power, as far as possible, to turn it into explicit power that can be achieved in an egalitarian way. To, and this is Castoriadis, create the institutions which, by being internalized by individuals, most facilitate their accession to their individual autonomy and their effective participation in all forms of explicit power existing in society. So I want to stress this point.
I have a question of clarification. You present a fairly complex articulation of different forms of power. Some of it I think I understood, but some of it I'm not sure I did. But in the end you say that we differentiate between power creator and a democratic creator, and you argue that that's not a correct way to present it, perhaps, and the correct way would be between heteronymous and autonomous. And I'm just not sure what's the difference between those, besides the fact that we're using different words. I mean, isn't demoskratia the notion of Castoriadis for autonomous? Thank you.
But should we take? Okay, I'll answer now. It's
connected to that question.
Okay.
So there's two you do.
Thanks.
That last quote you read,
yes,
right? Isn't that a democratic pre-order?
Of course, it's democratic.
No, but the last quote that
Yes.
you said, the participation in all forms
Yes,
of...
yes.
Surely that could be the democratic pre-order that
Yes.
Mr. Nitzan talked about.
My criticism is against the notion of power pre-order as the opposite of the democratic pre-order. I would argue that the democratic pre-order or the autonomous institution is also a power pre-order. So there is also, in the sense of Castoriadis, in this society, and a ground power of the social imaginary, which socializes the individuals in an ongoing process, in a way, yes, in another way than in a heteronymous institution, in a way that is in the direction of this participation and so on. So that was my point. I think you are in yes, you are in the spirit, in the same. We are in the same spirit, so to say. But I think we have a lot of discussions where the notion or the concept of power is negatively connoted. The power is the other, or something out there, or always a bad thing we have to oppose or we have to struggle with. I don't think that's the case.
In two years ago, when Jonathan did his presentation on systemic fear, one of the things that he kind of brought up was this idea that systemic fear comes along when there's kind of a collapse of confidence in obedience over the ruled. And I'm going to use the language of Castoriadis here, so forgive me for those that are not familiar with it, but I'm trying to think through your presentation, and I'm wondering, yes, you can make the argument that capitalist power is looking specifically at explicit power, and capitalization is an expression of that certain people, the rulers, do more often than those in below, right? So Charlie Chaplin in modern times does not, in a sense, he lives in that world, but he's not going through the same process. So my question is, even though it's only looking at what you would maybe call explicit power, does it kind of carry with it all of the kind of suggestions of a larger nomos, of a fact that if it is looking at a relation between business and industry or rulers and ruled, looking at the top, like a view from above, is still trying to understand that relation between the two?
Yes, I think that's the case, but I think there are some things to clarify, to be more precise, and to make explicit some connections, and to differentiate this, so to say, power dimensions more explicitly. I said it. There are several places in capitalist power where there are, so to say, there are approaches to do that, but it's not the main topic. I think to make it in this in this overall social theory context, and to relate it to that, but it can be done, I think.
The 5 minutes remain. You have time to ask questions.
I actually see a kind of a fundamental division between the power that you presented in the paper, and which you see as being somewhat problematically presented in capitalist power, and the way I see power being used in capitalist power, which you can take power as either what will explain the things that are happening in society, or you can take power as the thing to be explained. And I think capitalist power posits that power is both what explains and what is to be explained, but you obviously can't just perform that operation. Why do we have power? Well, because of power. That gets us nowhere. So then the root can be, well, power can explain these phenomenon, but what I think capitalist power is trying to explain is the quantitative asymmetries that we see in the financial realm that seem to correspond to all sorts of qualitative capacities. And they very specifically don't take power as the explanatory force to explain. Rather, they say these financial asymmetries are a measure of power that those who participate in these forces, how they understand their own qualitative capacities quantitatively. And that's what needs to be explained. where I think the power you're presenting and talking about and drawing out of Castoriadis is trying to postulate power as an explanatory mechanism, which goes against what Capital's power approach is, that rather power is what needs to be explained. So power itself can't explain power. We need to look at all of the other maneuvers that are going around in the social order to understand these asymmetries.
Just very brief point, without getting too much into a detailed discussion because we are running out of time. It's just that we follow the prescription that Hegel suggested, that power is nothing but its effect. And in fact, it's not Hegel's invention, it's the invention of Johann Kepler. Is the first one to actually argue that power is, or force is a relationship between entities, and it's a quantified relationship between entities, and we can understand it only by its effects. And then, of course, we have Galileo and we have Newton and so on that develop all those rules about force, for example, gravitation. We know about gravitation by the effects of gravitation. So we cannot see power or force in reality, quote unquote. What we can see are the consequences of it, and the consequences actually define what power is. So you go into a long digression of the different forms of power, and that's part of the social theory that you speak about. In my opinion, this is going backward in the history of the concept of force to the pre-scientific notion of power rather than the scientific notion of power. The pre-scientific notion of power is incredibly specific. It devises many, many different forms of power, as many as we can possibly devise, and that is the better. And that is something that can be associated with the multiplicity of gods, for example. The nature of the scientific notion of power is in the exact opposite direction, that we are trying to be reductive, and we're trying to devise force in the most universal form possible. So if we have a single force, it is the best thing. And this approach is brought to its extreme position by the theory of dynamism in physics associated with Kant, with Leibniz and Boscovich, that argue that force is not the glue that holds reality together. In fact, it's the elementary aspect of reality. Reality is just made of force. So I think that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to describe reality in terms of universal force, at least the reality of capitalism, whereas you're coming in 180 degrees towards it by trying to define many, many forms of power and saying that we have only one. Yeah, sure. But that's exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to argue that in capitalism, all of those qualitative dimensions of power are reduced to a singular type of measure that is a relation between entities, and it is entirely quantifiable, and therefore it can be applied to every, in principle at least, if capitalism is entirely universalized, can be applied to everything. So we are actually moving in opposite directions rather than in the same direction in terms of trying to articulate what force and power are.
I'm not sure.
It's not a question, it's a clarification. If you want to comment on it, by all means.
Do you want to make
I have to think. I have to think about it. By at first glance, for me, I think it's with Castoriadis. You will do the same. You are interested in the specificities. You have a power concept which is a large concept, so to say. And then you have specific societies with specific power, explicit power, and the norms of power. What you, as rightly describe, is in the direction of the capitalist form, so to say, of power. And this is a specific imaginary institution, but our interest should be, one interest should be to say this is, yes, historic specific. There are many other forms, could be or were in history. So it could be there could be the alternative, but I don't know if this fits the point.
So important time awaiting us, the lunch. So I think it is finished right now.
Thank you.